Lisa Townsend was elected as Surrey's Police and Crime Commissioner, SPCC, in May of 2021, a position created in 2011 in part with the purpose of tackling canteen culture, discriminatory attitudes found throughout the UK police force that are upheld by its insular nature. Yet, far from doing that, Ms. Townsend used her newfound position of authority to legitimise anti-Semitic conspiracies as a means of attacking the trans community and the UK LGBT+ charity Stonewall. Conspiracies that have recently garnered attention for appearing in the manifesto of the Buffalo shooter who rained terror upon Black Americans this past week. All of this is a fact that needs to be addressed, especially when we consider that Ms. Townsend is not alone. That said beliefs are a fundamental part of the so-called gender-critical ideology that plagues the UK. But before we do that, I first need to give a content warning for the following topics: antisemitism, racism, homophobia, and transphobia. If you like our work and appreciate the research put into each video, please consider supporting the channel via Patreon. You can also support us by liking, commenting, and sharing our work on social media. Hi there, my name is Ethel Thurston, and today we'll be taking a look at the way in which the Great Replacement is a foundational belief of the gender-critical ideology, and has even been promoted by figures such as SPCC, Lisa Townsend, all as a means of attacking both the trans and the larger LGBT+ community. This was a video I started in August of last year, yet due to poor health was unable to finish. I then covered most of the arguments I wanted to in my pieces regarding Rosie Duffield and the anti-Semitism at the Conservative Conference. However, following recent events, I felt it would be irresponsible of me not to talk about this topic in an attempt to draw attention to the general nature of gender-critical ideology, as well as the specifics regarding Ms. Townsend. But before we delve into Ms. Townsend's comments, we first need to understand the conspiracy known as the Great Replacement. The Great Replacement is a white supremacist conspiracy popularized in France, which asserts that white Europeans are being replaced by non-white people, both through immigration and birth rates. This is often referred to as white genocide by proponents of said conspiracy. An important feature of said conspiracy is the way in which it argues that this is being done with the support or complacency of an elite class, with elite in this context being a Nazi dog whistle for Jewish people. Indeed, the idea that Jewish people are deliberately weakening white European society is a belief almost as old as the notion of Europe itself, dating back long before Nazi Germany, and can even be seen as a direct extension of blood libel. Returning to the dog whistle, which is the use of coded or suggestive language in political messaging to garner support from a particular group without provoking opposition, other examples include globalist, cabal, dual loyalist, Illuminati, Khazars, New World Order, reptilians, and many, many more. In the same vein, any sort of reference to some vaguely defined order or lobby can also act as an anti-Semitic dog whistle, especially if it ticks other qualities of fascism, such as a notion of so-called degeneracy, e.g. the idea that queer people exist and are deserving of respect. Note, that's not to say all of these words or phrases are anti-Semitic all of the time, just that they're commonly used by Nazis. As always, you have to look at the greater context and make an assessment from there. The same goes for arguments that focus on Jewish bankers or investors. If you're criticizing them as part of general capitalism, listing Jewish figures among others, that's fine. But if you're singling out Jewish people, ignoring their Christian, Islamic, and Hindu counterparts, that's anti-Semitism using anti-capitalist critique as a cover. And it's in this idea of a Jewish world order that is apparently orchestrating the genocide of white people that the topic of trans people crop up. For you see, proponents of the Great Replacement like to argue that increasing awareness of the existence of trans people is actually the result of Jewish elites brainwashing youth en masse into believing that they are trans. That's why gender-critical hero Magdalene Burns kept referring to George Soros and John Stryker, both Jewish, as, quote, the money behind the transgender movement, end quote. It's why Helen Joyce referred to trans rights as a, quote, global agenda, end quote, funded by, quote, the world's most powerful people, end quote, listing only Jewish people as her examples, singling them out. She included both the aforementioned George Soros and John Stryker, as well as Jennifer Pritzker. This was in a published book, by the way, one celebrated by Ms. Joyce's personal friend, J.K. Rowling, who even invited Miss Joyce to her infamous luncheon. Which brings me to the Buffalo shooter who, on the 14th of May, murdered 10 people and injured a further 3 in Buffalo, New York. 11 of his victims were black and were the primary targets, with him painting anti-black slogans over his gun, including the statement, quote, "Here's your reparations," end quote. The shooter also talked at length about how the supposed Jewish world order was using black people to enact white genocide as part of the Great Replacement in what is reported to be his 180-page manifesto. However, regarding this video, we need to pay specific attention to pages 44 and 45. On page 44, we see the very popular "Who is behind the rise in transgenderism" misinfographic shared in gender-critical spaces, depicting a number of sensationalist headlines and images regarding trans youth on the top, a mention of Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute for Sex Research in the middle, with a number of figures along the bottom. Each figure has a blue Star of David painted on them, with the insinuation here being that Jewish people are responsible for the apparent rise in trans people. Focusing on Magnus Hirschfeld for a second, he was of course the gay Jewish founder of the Institute for Sex Research in Berlin that was one of the very first academies to study trans people. Sadly, the Nazis raided said institute, shutting it down as they rose to power, with the Nazis believing said institute to be the promoter of Jewish degeneracy, a belief that continues in fascist circles to this day. This is why the insinuation that there's some secretive order pushing queer degeneracy is always anti-Semitic. It's worth noting that it was the Institute's text that provided the bulk of the literature destroyed in public book burnings, setting trans research back decades. The Nazis did, however, keep a hold of the Institute's register, allowing them to round up and place its service users into concentration camps under the pink triangle. Moving on to page 45, we have an article titled "Transgender Camp Founder Talks Jewish Summer," with a photo from one of such camps depicting several youth practicing archery, captioned with the following, quote, "Notice that the camp is disproportionately white, and not only that, but the white people are really white, like Scandinavian-style white," end quote. And it's above this photo, alongside an anti-Semitic caricature of a Jewish person, that we get the how behind said Great Replacement beliefs, with a further caption role-playing as said Jewish caricature, reading, quote, "Hehe, yes, white goyim, on Jewish person, give your children to me and I'll make them think they're girls. Hehe, thus they'll all either kill themselves or become genetic dead ends. Oy vey, goyim, it's just too easy." End quote. So fascists, like the Buffalo shooter, see trans people as a way for the apparent Jewish world order to further decrease white fertility. And to make that argument, they single out Jewish people as the cause of transgender youth, with specific attention being paid to said youth's reproductive capabilities. Now, the Buffalo shooter forwarded trans youth camps as the means of indoctrinating them into thinking that they are trans, but this is not the only way proponents of the Great Replacement forward. Another way, so they claim, is through our schools, as can be seen in a series of comics by gender-critical icon Tatsuya Ishida, who you might recognize for his anti-trans propaganda that became insanely popular on Twitter. Well, in his regular comic, he depicts a fictional girl asking her mother about her gender, apparently afraid to wake up one day and discover that she's transgender, before having said mother barge in on the girl's teacher, brainwashing the children about trans issues, confronting the teacher, leading said teacher to cry as the mother leaves with her daughter. Then, in a future comic, Ishida has the teacher come out as a reptilian, which again is an anti-Semitic dog whistle popularized by David Icke. And they're not alone. Here is Ed West speaking at the official Conservative Party conference in 2021.
It's a sign of how bad things are that some of the pushback against kind of this kind of madder transgender stuff, which, by the way, all teenagers are now getting brainwashed with, which is just happening, and I can see it happening now, was by using gender-critical feminists as basically a human shield, because there's no conservatives who will go out there and use the conservative argument against this. We have to use other progressives to fight it. That makes me very pessimistic.
As for who is responsible, at least according to Mr. West, one only has to continue listening to find out.
In some ways, this is a kind of battle between, like the ruling class are basically international now. They don't really have, the period of the great national loyalties is in huge decline and has been since the time of the First World War. And there were just economic reasons to do that, to do with the global English, to do with the internet, the global economy. And so the nation thing becomes a kind of like minority opinion. And that's why the Conservatives, increasingly are more of a working class party. But they are set against the kind of ruling class. And that's a very difficult agenda to pull off. So, that's my basic thing, is that you're fighting against like the most well-connected, the most well-educated. You go to any elite institution these days, including the top public schools, and they are woke, to use that horrible word.
So we have an international ruling class with divided or dual loyalties that emerged from around the time of the First World War and are beholden to the whims of a global economy, who has subsequently infiltrated UK schools to brainwash children into this, quote, madder transgender stuff, end quote. Things have reached the point that many no longer have to state who they believe is responsible in any way, as with Transgender Trend, a UK-based hate group centered almost entirely on the idea that schools are indoctrinating young people into believing that they are trans as a means of sterilizing them, just like the Buffalo shooter. Indeed, the following can be found on the homepage of their website. Quote, established in 2015, Transgender Trend has led the way in advocating for the rights of children to reject gender stereotypes and be who they really are without discrimination, labeling, or medical interventions to fix them. We believe all children have the right to go through puberty and reach adulthood with their fertility intact, and that this is a fundamental human right. End quote. Emphasis mine, since I feel it's worth pointing out the repeated mentions of fertility. They also state, quote, Transgender Trend advocates for the most vulnerable children who are caught up in the recent trend in society to replace the objective reality of sex with the subjective idea of gender identity as the criteria for being a man or being a woman. Gender identity ideology teaches children who don't conform to masculine or feminine stereotypes that their personalities are wrong for their sex and their bodies are wrong for their gender identity. The number of children and young people who now believe they are really the opposite sex is reflected in the unprecedented recent trend in referrals to the Tavistock Gender Identity Development Service. End quote. Now, where is this ideology being taught? Why, Transgender Trend tells us in the following. Quote, in schools, all children deserve to be taught science-based facts, not ideology disguised as fact. All children have the right to privacy from the opposite sex in toilets and changing rooms. Policy in schools must always put safeguarding first, and schools should not use resources that confuse children about sex. End quote. Of course, none of this actually stands up to scrutiny. Puberty blockers are clinically safe and fully reversible, having first been developed for cisgender children going through early onset puberty. Supporting trans youth reduces depression by 60% and suicidality by 73%, making said practices literal lifesavers, and 90% of trans youth demonstrated a comprehensive understanding of puberty blockers within the guidelines laid out under Gillick competence, meaning that they are legally capable of consenting to said treatment and that it is their choice. It also means that the other 10% can be taught to understand, should they be interested in puberty blockers, allowing them to make an informed decision. It's also important to point out that trans children are less likely to hold to gender stereotypes than cis children and are less likely to give in to peer pressure regarding them. This is also why autistic people are more likely to be open about being transgender, because autism acts as a buffer that limits the hold social cohesion has over the individual. So everything transgender trend has stated is an objective lie. As for the remarks about fertility, this is a very common talking point among the gender-critical ideology, which likes to pretend that fully reversible puberty blockers, or even socially transitioning, so changing a child's pronouns and name, results in infertility. None of which is true, yet they have to keep pushing it since it is a key part of the Great Replacement conspiracy. And whilst Transgender Trend never state explicitly who they believe to be responsible in any of their articles, it is worth noting that Transgender Trend founder, Stephanie Davies-Arai, isn't so subtle. In response to a fellow transphobe telling Ms. Davies-Arai to follow the money, she responded by, once again, singling out George Soros. We also have this post made by the official Transgender Trend Twitter account, sharing a blog post by Michael Biggs that not only names Jennifer Pritzker, John Stryker, and George Soros, same as Helen Joyce, but openly downplays and even jokes about the facts that singling out Jewish investors as part of some conspiracy is entirely anti-Semitic. So members of the gender-critical ideology are keenly aware of what they are doing, they're just choosing to do so anyway. And it hasn't gone without notice, as can be seen in this comment to a Transgender Trend article about UK trans charity, Mermaids. The comment reads, quote, "There's a big money movement behind Born This Way, with these kids in the forefront. I don't completely understand it. I know George Soros is the top founder of trans charities, with Jennifer, formerly dead name Pritzker, right up there as well. I don't understand it. I only know that there's power in the push. This sudden blossoming of media and legal activity is not occurring in a vacuum. It's not possible for it to all be completely spontaneous, this exponential growth in putative trans kids, unless of course there's something in the water. Honestly, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but Born This Way is the clearly identified drumbeat in all the trans kid narratives, and Born This Way is winning." End quote. They later go on to add that, quote, "It is all about human rights and a progressive revolution, and maybe a touch of homophobia/eugenics in terms of lack of general public interest in the fate of these kids, particularly their reproductive capacity." End quote. Once again demonstrating that focus on reproductive capability. All of which goes to show that the narrative that Jewish people are infiltrating schools to indoctrinate children is a fundamental element of the gender-critical ideology. That this isn't a fringe belief within the movement, it is essential to their position. You cannot have gender-critical ideology without the Great Replacement conspiracy. Which brings us to the comments made by Lisa Townsend in her interview with the fascist rag, the Daily Mail. Headlined, "Police and Crime Commissioner for Surrey launches blistering attack on Stonewall for promoting dangerous transgender ideology that threatens the safety of our women and girls." As you can see, putting Ms. Townsend's status as the PCCS front and centre to offer her opinions legitimacy. Also notice the possessive nature of our women and girls, a theme shared by believers in the Great Replacement who view white women as baby factories rather than people. Now, said article is pretty monstrous overall, with Ms. Townsend attacking trans victims of rape and abuse, presenting them as inherently predatory. And I'm currently working on a video that will tackle that in further detail, discussing events regarding the Survivors Network. What I want to focus on in this video are statements made about Stonewall and the apparent trans lobby, statements like the following, quote, "Stonewall, which has drifted so far from its original mission, is now a threat to women and risks putting feminism back 50 years. End quote. So Townsend is very clearly taking a leaf from Ishide's book and is presenting the existence of trans people and the upholding of their rights as an existential threat to cis women. Now, that on its own might not be enough until we consider the following. Quote, police forces, in an attempt to correct many of the wrongs committed against minorities in the past, are being naive if they believe that Stonewall are anything but a well-funded lobby group for a dangerous ideology that threatens the safety of our women and girls. End quote. Pay close attention to the phrase, a well-funded lobby group. Well-funded by who, one has to wonder. Of course, that's the nature of a dog whistle. Never explicitly state what you mean, or do so as infrequently as possible, else people might catch on. It's better to simply pretend like there is some insidious shadow group puppeting everything from behind the screen, relying on what others, like those discussed earlier, have stated to fill in the gaps. We also see that the possessive nature of the headline statements regarding both women and girls was not an addition made by the Daily Mail, but rather Ms. Townsend, which is particularly troubling considering her position of power. Just what does she mean by our women? By our girls? This sort of possessiveness is not only incredibly misogynistic, but it also plays a central role in forming an us versus them mentality, which is central to the beliefs of those like the Buffalo shooter. Which, considering how Lisa Townsend seems okay with the anti-Roma police bills currently being passed, isn't all that shocking, if I'm honest. Us versus them seems rather central to her entire platform. But yeah, this screams anti-Semitism, and it only gets worse, with Townsend adding, quote, some were mothers alarmed about the influence of trans lobby groups in schools, end quote. So she's just gone full mask off, with Ms. Townsend, someone appointed for the purposes of curtailing bigotry in the UK police force, promoting the conspiracy that there are nefarious forces infiltrating British schools seeking to brainwash children with the supposedly dangerous trans ideology. It is literally her job to be aware of the forms bigotry takes to best ensure that police don't add to them. So ignorance is no excuse here, nor is her refusal to name who she thinks is infiltrating said schools or funding the trans lobby. As already shown, members of the gender-critical ideology are more than capable of filling in the blanks themselves. Townsend chose to promote the Great Replacement's talking points as a means of attacking trans victims of rape and abuse. And that's all people will see. A police official promoting the very same anti-Semitic rhetoric the far right has been selling them for decades, seeking to once more legitimize said beliefs as a respectable position for a public official to hold. Townsend is directly aiding the push to take the Great Replacement from a fringe conspiracy to mainstream talking point. Yet what's most disturbing about this whole ordeal is that nobody called this out. Yes, people criticized the transphobia, but the anti-Semitism was completely ignored, something we do at our own peril. Anti-Semitism is one of the strongest motivators when it comes to far-right violence, because on top of hurting the Jewish community, it acts as a way for the far-right to demonize every other marginalized group. With the Buffalo shooter, it was black people. For the UK gender-critical ideology, it's trans people. But it's also Middle Eastern people. It's the Roma, the disabled, the gay and lesbian. It is a horrifically efficient way to get most white Europeans to turn on the marginalized. And this entire case is a reminder to those of us from the UK that we are not immune to this sort of rhetoric and violence as people often pretend. In fact, we've institutionalized it, declaring the Great Replacement a protected belief in the case of Mayor Forstarter, normalizing it to the point that a police official is publicly making the same arguments as mass shooters. Because, whilst the Buffalo shooter is the latest, they are certainly not the first, and unless we act, they won't be the last. Because it's not just Ms. Townsend, it's transgender trend, it's Tatsuya Ishida, it's Helen Joyce, it's Magdalene Burns, it's the entire fucking UK Conservative Party. The whole system is rotten to the core, and we can't begin to properly tackle transphobia in the UK until we're ready and willing to tackle the anti-Semitism much as said transphobia is rooted in. Just like we can't truly tackle transmisogyny without first acknowledging how many of its methods were perfected by white supremacists enacting misogyny. It's just not possible, and we are weakening ourselves by ignoring things and pretending like transphobia is a separate issue that has no crossover with either anti-black racism or anti-Semitism. So let's do better. Let's get the word out and equip ourselves and others with the knowledge regarding what we are fighting. Because only as a united front are we going to be able to tackle the rise of fascism in both the UK and the US. And that starts by calling it out and making sure that the issue is seen. Lisa Townsend bolstered an anti-Semitic conspiracy as part of her transphobic attack, and in doing so, put everyone's lives in danger, proving once again that the limits and restrictions placed on UK police in an attempt to reform them are nothing but a cruel joke. If you appreciate what we do here and want to help out, please consider becoming one of our wonderful patrons who make all this possible. On that note, we'd just like to thank the following people: Matthew Kovac, Hannah Banghart, Gert Van Voorst, Sosh Daniels, Cthulhu, Higgins the Seagull, and Flynn. And from myself, Edita, and Levi, take care now.